From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden issues an executive order that he says will close the border to migrants. But is there less here than meets the eye, and will it be enough to contain the political damage of 3 years of border crisis as the White House eyes the November election? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, Alicia Finley and Jillian Melcher. On Tuesday, the president moved at long last to address one of his biggest political vulnerabilities, citing provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. He issued an executive order that he says will close the border once the average of daily illegal crossings hits 2,500, which it seems, given recent trends, would be immediately. Let's listen to a piece of the president announcing this executive action.
I'm moving past Republican obstruction and using the executive authorities available to me as president to do what I can on my own to address the border. Frankly, I would have preferred to address this issue through bipartisan legislation because that's the only way to actually get the kind of system we have now that's broken, fixed, to hire more Border Patrol agents, more asylum officers, more judges. But Republicans have left me no choice. Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants will be restricted from receiving asylum at our southern border unless they seek it after entering through an established lawful process.
And here is Joe Biden again trying to draw a contrast with his opponent in that November election, Donald Trump.
I believe that immigration has always been the lifeblood of America. We're constantly renewed by an infusion of people and new talent. The Statue of Liberty is not some relic of American history. It stands for who we are as the United States. So I will never demonize immigrants. I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border. I will not ban people from this country because of their religious beliefs. I will not use the U.S. military to go into neighborhoods all across the country to pull millions of people out of their homes and away from their families to put detention camps while awaiting deportation, as my predecessor says he will do if he occupies his office again.
Alicia, to start at the beginning, can you give us a sense of what this executive order intends to do and how much you think it will help at the border?
So the executive order, in some ways, is a spinoff of the bill that was being negotiated by Oklahoma Senator James Lankford earlier this year in return for Ukraine aid. And I say it's a spinoff because it includes some similarities in that the Lankford bill would have mandated the closure of the border when encounters exceeded 5,000 per day, averaged over a week. Now, the Biden executive order actually is more stringent. It would supposedly close the border. When I say close, I mean block any kind of new asylum claims if these exceed 2,500 on average over the course of a week. But you also have to consider that there are numerous exemptions to this, including that those who apply for asylum through the CBP One app at ports of entry. So it would only apply when those crossings or encounters are between the ports of entry. It would also exempt unaccompanied children. Now, right now, those aren't like a huge amount. I calculate around 500 or 600 a day of unaccompanied minors. But this exemption could encourage them more to come. And there's also a big carve out, and this they may have done for legal reasons, hoping that providing this carve out for anyone who quote unquote faces an imminent and extreme threat to life or safety, such as imminent threat of rape, kidnapping, torture, or murder. And this is kind of the Convention Against Torture standard. And why I say that they may have done this for legal reasons is that there was a decision by the Ninth Circuit in 2020 that struck down something that President Trump did, blocking asylum claims because it contravened these conventions against torture. So this may have been why the White House actually carved this out. But as a result, it's a very porous executive order. And we'll see, it may be immediately blocked by courts, just like a lot of the Trump executive orders and rules were with regards to immigration. The ACLU has already said it plans to sue, and it'll probably sue. I would not be surprised if it gets an immediate injunction by a district judge in the Ninth Circuit within the next week. That's typically what happened with a lot of the Trump orders. So we'll see how fiercely the Biden administration actually defends this.
Jillian, what's your take on this? I guess my interest is piqued by the fact that this trigger will not count admissions, asylum entrance at ports of entry, because I wonder if this will just funnel people from areas of the border that are in the desert or over the Rio Grande into those ports of entry. And it's true that the U.S. can maybe better meter the inflow that way. But if people showing up at ports of entry and claiming that they have a real asylum need are still being put into that asylum process in the absence of the Remain in Mexico policy that required those people to wait for their hearings and adjudications outside the U.S. on the southern side of the border fence, I don't see how that's going to stem the flow that has become pretty overwhelming in recent years.
Yeah, so this kind of cuts back asylum applicants. And the way that it does that is if you show up at the port of entry, it's right on the border. You have to make this appointment using the app, or you have to queue up in some places. So CBP is able to kind of restrict this or limit the number of people who get appointments to even begin asking for asylum per day. And that's had some effect. I mean, I was looking at a Texas Tribune story saying that asylum seekers who've used this app in Reynosa and Matamoros are waiting 8 to 10 months for an appointment. So it actually can sort of be a limit on the number of people doing it at the port of entry. But the risk here is that you create an incentive for people to just continue trying to get across illegally. I mean, they may be in their minds considering, if I try to sneak across the border, are my odds better under a Biden administration than in a couple of months of possible Trump administration? So that might have a bit of a perverse incentive effect. I think Alicia also mentioned the exemption for unaccompanied minors. That's something that's been on the uptick in recent years. You may have more parents deciding, well, I can't get across, but my kid can, so sending them across. And that's something that in turn strains border resources. These are really vulnerable children crossing the border. It takes a lot of effort from the border guards who are patrolling to pick up these kids sometimes, whether they're crossing a river, whether they're crossing a really harsh desert environment. So that's something that requires resources and can make other parts of the border more vulnerable.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Alicia, what do you make of the threats of legal challenge to this executive order? The ACLU, I believe, is already saying that it plans to bring a lawsuit. And one section of the law that President Biden is relying on here is Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And here's what it says. Whenever the president finds that the entry of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation and for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, and it goes on from there. But Alicia, that looks to me like pretty broad authority delegated by Congress in this law to the President of the United States.
Right. So I will quote from the Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion in the case that challenged Donald Trump's travel ban, which relied on the same statutory provision. And the Chief says, by its plain language, this provision grants the president broad discretion to suspend the entry of aliens into the United States. The president lawfully exercised that discretion based on his findings following a worldwide multi-agency review that entry of the covered aliens would be detrimental to the national interest. And plaintiffs' attempts to identify a conflict with other provisions in the INA and their appeal to the statute's purposes and legislative history fail to overcome the clear statutory language. Now, that seems to suggest that the Supreme Court thinks that this provision is pretty broad and gives the president sweeping authority to block any new entries. And again, entries in that case, if you recall with the travel ban, they distinguish between entries, the president's ability to block new entry and actually the visas, provide new visas. And again, here, just like in the travel ban case, I think the Biden administration is going to lean on this kind of carte blanche authority to block migrants from coming in, notwithstanding any other provisions in the Immigration Nationality Act that these liberal groups are probably going to plan to cite. The Chief Justice's opinion also said, the president doesn't really have to do much or explain much. President Ronald Reagan explained it in just merely 5 sentences when he actually invoked the same provision to curtail the continuing illegal migration by sea of large numbers of undocumented aliens. So presidents have from time to time used it and invoked this authority. In many ways, it doesn't have to be permanent. It can be temporary. And again, the president has a lot of latitude on how he uses this. I would suspect these liberal groups are going to invoke the Ninth Circuit decision that I mentioned earlier regarding the conventions against torture. Again, Ninth Circuit, it's controlling precedent in the Ninth Circuit, but not nationwide, and they may file in the Ninth Circuit. But I think if this were ever to get up to the Supreme Court, I think it would be upheld. One little problem, it could be the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act. So the Department of Homeland Security and Justice Department are actually promulgating rules to carry out these authorities that the president has laid out here. So there may also be a challenge under the Administrative Procedure Act saying that this is arbitrary and capricious, the way they're doing this, or they haven't considered the cost or the benefits to certain groups. And that could be a more potent challenge.
One question, though, is why it took President Biden this long to invoke this authority. And Speaker Mike Johnson came to visit the Journal recently, and one thing he said, and this was all on the record, so I'm not betraying any confidences, he said, "I have read the president myself, Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act." Speaker Johnson said the president first tried to convince him that it did not exist. He said he brought the president a copy and made him acknowledge it. And Jillian, it does seem like there is an argument from some in the administration that the numbers we are seeing at the border are bad, but they're not so much worse than the numbers we were seeing previously. And it's true that this migrant crisis has been going on for a while now. The number of southern border encounters in the year 2019 was about 850,000, according to federal data. And that was the highest in a decade. That is not a good number. And I would commend to people the Journal's editorial on this. Biden's border election gambit is the headline, has a chart on these numbers. But you compare that 850,000 in 2019 to 1.7 million the first year that President Biden was in office, 2021, even higher in 2022, and then 2023, 2.47 million. Jillian, it does seem like there was a step change somewhere in between when President Trump left office and when President Biden came into office. And part of that may be the message that he sent when he came in shortly after his inauguration and rescinded all of these policies like Remain in Mexico.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you go down to the border and you're actually talking to migrants who have recently crossed, one thing that's kind of surprising is hearing how aware they are of the political atmosphere and how they're using that to make calculations on the timing that they cross and how they cross. And I think they got the Biden administration's message loud and clear that this is your opportunity, that they'd witnessed the Trump years. And they certainly saw a more inviting opportunity to come make their attempts. And just in terms of this political moment, I think it's really interesting. You've got President Biden on one hand trying to differentiate himself from Trump. He has a progressive faction of the party that's basically pro-open borders. But then you're also seeing in the polls a lot of public discontent about immigration. I mean, voters are looking at this and seeing that in 2023, in 2022, 2021, each of those years were record-breaking for encounters at the border. And now you've got in April, 27% of Americans saying the top problem facing the U.S. is immigration. And I think if you start digging into some of that polling, it's quite interesting. Even places that you wouldn't necessarily suspect immigration to be popping up as a political discontent, it's beginning to happen. And I think what's going on here is cities like New York City, Chicago are starting to deal with an influx of migration that previously has been kind of limited to these border towns. I was looking at a Quinnipiac poll a couple months ago saying that 85% of New York City voters are concerned about just how to accommodate these migrants. In Chicago, a plurality recently was saying that they think it might be a good idea to rethink whether Chicago is even a sanctuary city. They were concerned about crime, drugs, just the affordability of being able to accommodate people. So I think the political winds on this are shifting. And the Biden administration also sees, after the Ukraine border deal fell apart, a chance to blame Republicans for the immigration issue, to, I guess, make them own it rather than the Democrats. And that's what you see the Biden administration trying to do, saying that there's ideally a legal solution to this, but that Republicans blew their chance.